Thank you, everyone, for registering to attend today's Zoom webinar. If this is your first Alt Liberal Arts event, Alt Liberal Arts is a nonprofit education initiative partnered with Open Society University Network, Bard College, and PEN America that provides virtual alternatives to fill the gaps created by Senate Bill 266 and other censorious legislation that is impacting what can be taught in Florida's classrooms. Our past events have included a panel on the authoritarian assault on gender studies with Judith Butler and Masha Gessen, and an ongoing 4-part lecture series on storytelling with Neil Gaiman. My name is Dr. Stephen Miles, and I'm a former provost of the New College of Florida, professor emeritus of music, and the founder of the contemporary music series, New Music, New College. Today, I'm introducing the distinguished Henry Charles Leo Professor of the History of Science and affiliated Professor of Earth and Planetary Sciences at Harvard University, Dr. Naomi Oreskes. Dr. Oreskes is an internationally renowned science historian and prolific author of dozens of books, essays, and editorials on environmental science and the politics of anthropogenic climate change. One of her most influential works is her 2004 essay, The Scientific Consensus on Climate Change, the first peer-reviewed paper to document the scientific consensus on this crucial issue. It has been featured in the landmark Royal Society publication, A Guide to Facts and Fictions About Climate Change, and the Academy Award-winning film, An Inconvenient Truth. In 2018, she was named a Guggenheim Fellow for a book project with Eric M. Conway, The Big Myth, How American Business Taught Us to Loathe Government and Love the Free Market. It was released by Bloomsbury Press this February and has been widely reviewed, including in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, and the New Yorker. Alt Liberal Arts is honored and thrilled to have partnered with Dr. Naomi Oreskes to bring you today's lecture, The Intersection of Science and Politics. Alt Liberal Arts also has several other lectures and panels that are free and open to the public, including a panel on Monday about the roles of colleges and universities as civic actors with Margie Ensign and Jonathan Becker. You can learn more about upcoming events at altliberalarts.org. And now, Dr. Naomi Oreskes.
Thank you. Well, it's a pleasure to be here with you. I was invited today to talk about science and politics and its relationship to current affairs. And as I was preparing for this talk, I realized that could take me about 7 hours. So I thought what I would do today is just give you a couple of slices out of some of the work I've been doing about the political economy of scientific knowledge and how attacks on science are related to bigger questions in neoliberalism, attacks on social welfare, and of course, attacks on academics. So I'm going to just dive in. I'm going to try to keep it to about half an hour or maybe a little more to give us plenty of time for questions and conversations. And I hope it's not too much. So I'm going to go ahead now and share my screen. Okay. I'd like to start my story in the year 1988, which was when the New York Times reported that global warming had begun, an expert told the U.S. Senate. That expert, sorry, I have to make my slides move. That expert was this man, the NASA climate modeler Jim Hansen, who told the U.S. Congress that he was 99% certain that he and his team were 99% certain that climate change caused by man's activities, human activities, was now detectable. A few months later, the Times concluded that the issue of an overheating world has suddenly moved to the forefront of public concern. It had also become a matter of congressional concern. In 1988, that same year, Senator Tim Wirth of Colorado introduced the National Energy Policy Act to establish a national energy policy that will quickly reduce the generation of carbon dioxide and trace gases to slow the pace and degree of atmospheric warming. 4 years later, as some of you may know, President George H.W. Bush signed an international treaty to fight climate change, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. This framework committed its signatories to preventing dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system, sometimes referred to as DAI. And when he signed this treaty, President Bush called on world leaders to translate the written document into concrete action to protect the planet. So here we are in 2023. A Category 5 hurricane is bearing down on Acapulco even as we speak. It has shown the most rapid intensification of any Pacific hurricane ever in history. We know that climate change is all around us. So what happened? Why didn't we act on that scientific knowledge that we already had more than 30 years ago, before most of the students in this room were even born? Well, in our previous work, Eric Howe and I showed that the answer was not for lack of scientific information or lack of clear communication, but rather that the emergence of the scientific consensus on climate change in the late 80s to early 90s triggered a politically motivated campaign to cast doubt on that science and thereby block action. This was the story that Eric and I told in our book, Merchants of Doubt, a story about a cadre of scientists, not climate scientists, but physicists, who cast doubt not just on climate science, but on the facts related to a set of issues that involve public health and environmental protection, including the harms of tobacco, the reality of acid rain, and the threat of ozone depletion. When we wrote this book, one of the questions we wanted to answer was why would educated, intelligent people deny basic scientific facts, especially about something as harmful, as well established as the harms of tobacco, or as consequential as the ozone hole? And what we saw was that the answer was politics, that science denial had nothing to do with science itself. And by that, I mean it wasn't based on problems in the science, like inadequate data, sample sizes that were too small, or models that were too uncertain, but it had everything to do with political ideology, and specifically the ideology of market fundamentalism, the belief in the so-called magic of the marketplace, not exactly the same as neoliberalism, but closely connected to it. So this is the issue we took on in our new book that, as you heard, just came out this year, called The Big Myth. It's a history of market fundamentalism. So in this book, we ask, where did market fundamentalism come from? Why has it had such a hold? And how is it related to some of the problems that you are living through in Florida right as we speak? So market fundamentalism is best explained as belief in the so-called magic of the marketplace, the power and efficiency of the so-called free market, but coupled to hostility to government action in the marketplace, especially regulation. Market fundamentalists will argue, and they do argue in places like the Wall Street Journal, that government needs to, quote, get out of the way and just let markets do their magic. But it's coupled to another worry, a political worry that government regulation is a backdoor to totalitarianism. They refer to environmentalists as watermelons, green on the outside, but red on the inside. So there's a kind of red baiting, an attack on left politics in general, which explains why a scientific issue like the harms of tobacco or carbon pollution got politicized. Because in their view, it is in fact the political system and not just some scientific facts or even economic facts that is at stake. So where did market fundamentalism come from? And why did so many people accept it to the point that they would reject well-established scientific evidence of serious harms like death and disease from tobacco use or the damages of climate disruption and reject the need for government action to address them? So this is the story we tell in our new book. It's the history of a set of purposeful, coordinated, orchestrated programs by American business leaders to promote free market ideology, to promote market fundamentalism in academia, public education, popular culture, and politics. To convince us that free markets are essential to the American way of life and that anything else, even modest compromises to economic freedom, like a minimum wage law, is a threat to the American way of life. What we show in the new book is that industry groups and conservative business leaders used the same strategies that we studied in Merchants of Doubt throughout the 20th century. In other words, the strategies we talked about in Merchants of Doubt, we now can trace back even further in time to arguments to limit government protections for labor, including child labor in the early 20th century, to prevent or limit regulation of industries like the electricity industry, to protect private sector actors from responsibility for the costs of their product, like air pollution and water pollution, and to deny the reality of climate change and prevent the sort of action that back in 1992 looked to be imminent. They did this by a set of efforts, including advertising, marketing, attempts to influence radio, film, television, news coverage, and, most pertinent to what's going on today, a program in the 1920s to rewrite school and college textbooks and influence college and university curricula to be more pro-market and anti-government. All of these diverse activities, and I don't have time today to talk about all of them, but they include, as I said, film, radio, children's books. They were all intended to persuade the American people that any compromise to economic freedom, even something as seemingly reasonable like decreasing child labor, threatened our other freedoms and therefore the American way of life. This project culminates in the election of Ronald Reagan, and in the book we dig into Ronald Reagan's early history, his relationship with the General Electric Corporation, and how he transitioned while working for GE from being a New Deal Democrat to being the Ronald Reagan of history. And of course, the remaking of the Republican Party, so to the point that we now have a party that is so anti-government that it can't even govern, even when it is in positions of governance. But part of the argument about the book is that it's not just a story about Republicans. It's a story also about how these ideas influence Democrats as well, so that the Democratic Party under Bill Clinton steps back from its earlier commitments to use the power of the federal government to protect workers, consumers, and the environment. So telling the story of the big myth required a big book. It's more than 500 pages, but I assure you, you don't have to read it all. So I was trying to think about how do I summarize this book in a few short words today. And I think the short answer is simply to say, Hillary was right. Some of you may have remembered that some years ago, Hillary Clinton said that she and her husband were up against a vast right-wing conspiracy. The word conspiracy is a fighting word. I like to call it an orchestrated program, a network, but in a sense, she was right. And in this book, we show how right she actually was. So the story of this book begins in the 1930s with ex-President Herbert Hoover. As you all know, Hoover lost the presidency in 1932 to Franklin Delano Roosevelt and has historically been viewed by many people as a discredited president because of his conspicuous failure to address the crisis of the Great Depression. But in fact, he remained highly influential in the Republican Party, in conservative and business circles. And in 1934, he laid out the crux, the central argument that becomes the basis of market fundamentalist ideology in the United States. Oh, sorry, I wanted to read that to you. So he writes, "It holds both in principle and in experience that intellectual and spiritual freedoms cannot thrive except where there are also economic freedoms. It insists equally upon protections to all these freedoms, or there is no liberty." In other words, we cannot have political freedom if we don't also have economic freedom. This argument is then taken up by a group of plutocrats led by J. Howard Pugh, the chairman of the Sun Oil Company, an important leader in a trade organization that still exists today and still fights against climate action, the National Association of Manufacturers. Throughout the 20s and 30s, NAM launched a multi-million-dollar propaganda campaign targeted particularly at teachers, but also at ministers and other community leaders and ordinary citizens to promote this idea that if we compromise economic freedom, for example, through a child labor law, we would lose our political freedom. In 1939, NAM organized these arguments under the slogan, "The Tripod of Freedom." In a world torn by war and dictatorship, Americans live at peace and freedom. The best assurance that we shall remain free and at peace is our faith in constitutional representative democracy, in free enterprise, and in civil and religious liberty as inseparable fundamentals of freedom to be cherished and preserved at all costs. This idea was promoted in a variety of different formats, including aggressively in a popular, widely syndicated radio program called The American Family Robinson. The program vilified FDR and the New Deal and extolled the virtues of capitalism. Its purpose, in NAM's own words, so this comes from their own documents, was to present openly and as effectively and attractively as possible the fundamental principle that freedom of speech and of the press, freedom of religion, and freedom of enterprise, that is to say business freedom, are inseparable. So this becomes an argument for protecting the prerogatives of business leaders to pay their workers as little as they wanted, or to have conditions in their factories that were as dangerous as they wanted. I'm going to skip over this little bit of that. Okay. Now, Pew and his colleagues, though, faced at least three problems in getting this message across. The first one was that the indivisibility thesis just was not true. Free enterprise was not one of the basic principles on which this country was founded. It appears nowhere in the Declaration of Independence, nowhere in the Constitution, and in fact, government had been deeply involved in the American economy throughout the 19th century. It was also hypocritical because Nam, Pew, and Herbert Hoover were arguing for businessmen's freedoms to set wages and working hours in their factories, but they fought bitterly, and sometimes violently, against their workers' freedom to unionize or engage in collective bargaining. And it was self-serving. In the 1940s, memories of the Depression were still vivid and bitter. As historian Wendy Wall has noted, in the wake of the economic collapse, the narrative of, quote, capitalist-driven growth seemed questionable at best, a monstrous delusion at worst. So how would they solve this problem? The answer? Recruit intellectuals to help them. American business leaders in the 1940s recruited two of the founders of neoliberalism, and this is where neoliberalism enters the story, to come to America and promote these ideas as part of a neoliberal intellectual agenda. The two intellectuals were Friedrich von Hayek, who some of you may have heard of, and his mentor, Ludwig von Mises, often thought to be the founder of the Austrian School of Economics. These plutocrats financed positions for these scholars at New York University and the University of Chicago with no open search, no competition, and then they produced simplified versions of their arguments that were heavily promoted in popular contexts. And then they funded additional academics to refine the argument and carry it forward, particularly at the University of Chicago in the Chicago School of Economics. Now, it's important to look at how this was done because it's similar in some ways to what we're seeing now with the misrepresentation of history and the misrepresentation of classic canonical texts. So Hayek's 1944 book, The Road to Serfdom, was a sophisticated articulation of the indivisibility thesis. It focused on Soviet communism and the risks of central planning, but it also suggested that even in a non-communist society like the United Kingdom, if economic freedom were compromised, for example, by implementing a national health service, it would put that society on the road to serfdom. So it's a slippery slope argument, and it would be later used by the tobacco industry to fight tobacco regulation. But it's important to recognize that Hayek himself allowed for many exceptions. So he wrote in his book, quote, "The successful use of competition as the principle of social organization precludes certain types of coercive interference with economic life, but it admits of and even requires others." So what were some of these others that it did admit of? Well, signposts on roads, preventing deforestation, harmful effects of some methods of farming, or the noise and smoke of factories, limiting working hours, enforcing sanitary conditions, preventing violent strikes. Hayek also argued for some form of social insurance, or what today we would call social security. He writes, "There can be no question that adequate security against severe privation and the reduction of the unavoidable causes of misdirected effort and consequent disappointment will have to be one of the main goals of policy." And he explicitly rejected the argument for laissez-faire economics. It is important not to confuse opposition against central planning with a dogmatic laissez-faire attitude. The liberal argument is in favor of making the best possible use of the forces of competition as a means of coordinating human efforts, not an argument for leaving things just as they are. But in the hands of his acolytes, it became an argument for laissez-faire, an argument for leaving things as they were, particularly when it came to addressing the failures of capitalism. In fact, it took on the quality of religious faith. And so the business leaders who brought von Hayek to America then arranged for a Reader's Digest version to be published, in which they took out all of the caveats, all of the places where Hayek says you do need social security and you do need to act to prevent pollution, And they published it in 1945 in Reader's Digest with this frontispiece next to it: political and economic rights to protect the dignity and freedom of the individual. And you can see this is set up as a kind of 10 commandments. At the base, is the fundamental belief in God, so it's based on Judeo-Christian theology. And my favorite one is this one on the bottom right: the right to freedom from arbitrary government regulation and control. And then they pushed it even further, turning the argument into a literal cartoon, a comic book, that was published in Look magazine and then distributed by General Motors Corporation. The cartoon begins with the government mobilizing the economy during World War II, and it ends 18 squares later with political dissenters being shot in a firing squad. Now, we don't know for sure, but Ronald Reagan's biographers have suggested, we know that Ronald Reagan read Hayek. We know that in later years he promoted Hayek as a great hero. The evidence suggests that he read the Reader's Digest version. And we know that these popularizations reached huge audiences of millions of Americans. And in these versions, as I just said, all of the caveats, all of the nuance, and all of the discussions of legitimate forms of interference in the marketplace were removed. And then these business leaders did the same thing to Adam Smith. This all occurred as part of something called the Free Market Project at the University of Chicago. Von Hayek had been brought to America to be part of this project that was conceptualized and funded by a former executive at the DuPont Corporation, a man named Jasper Crane, and a man named Harold Lunow, head of the libertarian Volcker Foundation. The idea was to fund an academic program at a prestigious university to develop a blueprint for, quote, an effective competitive system of free enterprise. Now, it's clear from the documentary evidence that this was not objective, independent research because the arguments were decided in advance. They would argue for the primacy of the free market as the most efficient organizer of society, and they would explain that the market is systematic, rational, not chaotic or disorderly, but consistently efficient in allocating resources to their best use. So in other words, these basic principles that we hear all the time from economists are not the results of findings, they're stipulated in advance. And they would emphasize the relationship between capitalism and freedom, with an emphasis on regulation as, quote, a menace to the free market and therefore to freedom generally. So we see here that these champions of competition did not actually support a free market of ideas or even open inquiry. As I've already mentioned, there was no open search for these jobs, no competitive process for funding the research. Rather, they handpicked participants. They got at least some of them hired behind closed doors, and without external review, funded the research that supported their political ideology. So who were these participants? Well, two additional key figures are people you may well have heard of: George Stigler and Milton Friedman, both of whom would later win the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economics. I want to say a little bit more about Stigler because I think he's super important. So in 1957, Stigler published an edited version of Adam Smith's classic work, The Wealth of Nations. And just as the edited version of The Road to Serfdom left out all of Hayek's caveats, so did the Chicago School version of The Wealth of Nations. Now, The Wealth of Nations is a giant book. It's over 1,000 pages. So obviously, any edited volume intended for undergraduate teaching would have to leave out a lot. But Stigler left out all the passages where Smith recognized the limits of self-interest and the need for taxation, regulation, and restraints on self-interest to protect public safety. These included discussions of banking regulation, taxation to support public goods like roads and bridges, minimum wages, and the rights of workers to unionize to counter the power of factory owners. So I think I'm going to skip the details about banking regulation, but just to make the important point that Smith recognized that some observers would object to any regulation as a denial of freedom, and in response he offered a succinct summary of when regulation was warranted. He wrote, quote, when the natural liberty of a few individuals endangers the security of the whole society. Reckless bankers did exactly that, so he concluded, the obligation of building firewalls in order to prevent the communication of fire is a violation of natural liberty exactly of the same kind with the regulations of the banking trade, which are here proposed. In other words, regulations are not just acceptable, but actually necessary when the actions of some individuals or corporations threaten the freedom, safety, or security of the rest of us. Jacob Viner, a leading figure in the early history of the Chicago School, wrote, "The modern advocate of laissez-faire, who objects to government participation in business on the grounds that it is an encroachment upon a field reserved by nature for private enterprise, cannot find support for this argument in the wealth of nations." So why don't more of us know this? Why do we think of Smith as an advocate of untrammeled self-interest? Well, because that's the version of Adam Smith that the late Chicago School created and sustained. And this was, to a very significant degree, also the work of a second key figure who many of you probably have heard of, Milton Friedman. In 1962, Friedman published his book, Capitalism and Freedom. It was essentially a restatement of The Road to Serfdom, but written for an American audience and without the caveats that Hayek had included in his book. It was based on a series of lectures funded by the Volcker Foundation, and it was, in fact, the blueprint for the effective competitive system of free enterprise that Crane and Lenow had planned and paid for. The central argument was the same as Hayek's argument, that the great threat to freedom is the concentration of power. Thereby, he argues, by distributing power, the marketplace protects freedom. Therefore, capitalism protects freedom, and compromises to capitalism threaten freedom. In other words, it is the indivisibility thesis all over again. Road to Serfdom has been touted by many of America's most prominent conservative voices, people like Glenn Beck, shown here with the book cover in the background, Rush Limbaugh, The National Review, Tucker Carlson, Ted Cruz, Michelle Bachmann, Paul Ryan, and many, many more. In 1991, von Hayek received the Presidential Medal of Freedom from Ronald Reagan. And Capitalism and Freedom was even more influential. First published in 1962, so 60 years ago, it is still in print today. It's on nearly every top 10 list of conservative books and most top 100 books of all time. Friedman served as an advisor to Margaret Thatcher and to Ronald Reagan, and as I've already mentioned, in 1976, won the Nobel Prize in Economic Science. In the 80s, he became one of the most prominent public intellectuals of the 20th century, in part because of a television series on public television financed by a libertarian business leader called Free to Choose. And this television series was then supported by a full-fledged marketing campaign, including a companion book, to explain the benefits of capitalism and political freedom to the world, and a foundation called the Free to Choose Network. And again, all financed by American business leaders. And then Friedman was awarded both the National Medal of Freedom and the National Medal of Science. Now, Ronald Reagan is, of course, a key figure in this story because he brings these ideas back into the mainstream of the Republican Party, but then also because he extends the argument against regulation of markets into an argument against environmental protection and public health. In effect, an argument against government role in addressing market failure and the needs of ordinary people. And I just thought I would give you two quotations just to compare how the Republican Party shifted hard to the right under Ronald Reagan, influenced by these ideas. In 1954, the Republican President Dwight Eisenhower wrote in a letter to his brother, "The federal government cannot avoid or escape responsibilities which the mass of people firmly believe should be undertaken by it. Should any political party attempt to abolish Social Security, unemployment insurance, or eliminate labor laws and farm programs, you would not hear of that party again in our political history. There is a tiny splinter group, of course, that believes you can do these things. Among them are a few Texas oil millionaires and occasional politician or businessman from other areas. But their number is negligible, and they are stupid." In 1980, I know, that's a great quotation. In 1980, Ronald Reagan says, "Government is not the solution to our problems. Government is the problem." Now, the story was also tied to the end of the Cold War. Because in 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell, and a couple of years later when the Soviet Union collapsed, free market capitalism was seen by many people as vindicated by the collapse of the Soviet Union. And right-wing intellectuals took this to argue that if capitalism was the better system, then the best form of capitalism was its purest form. And that meant the less government, the better. And so the end of the Cold War and the rise of Ronald Reagan reinforced each other in order to bring these ideas, which had been pretty much discredited in the Eisenhower years, to bring them back to the fore. So what we argue in our work is that it's not a coincidence that the key players in Merchants of Doubt were Cold War physicists. They were men who had dedicated their lives to containing communism and protecting freedom as they understood it. What we see then in our work is that by the 1990s, this argument becomes extended by business conservatives, by Republican conservatives, by right-wing think tanks into a general right-wing attack on science and expertise, because it is science and scientists who have pointed out these market failures. It's scientists who have proven the dangers of child labor. It's scientists who proved the reality of the ozone hole. It's scientists who showed that tobacco killed 6 or 7 million people every year. And of course, it's scientists who have proven that climate change is real, and now, according to the IMF, doing over $1 trillion in damage every single year. And recently, then, we've seen this generalized into attacks on academics more broadly. Today, there are attacks on academia being promulgated by a large network of free market think tanks and foundations. And I can't fit them all on one slide without using illegible font, but these are just an example of some of the institutes that we've come across in our work, all of whom promote free market solutions to social problems, all of whom claim to stand for, quote, small government, although they're perfectly happy with big government when it suits their needs, all of whom have been involved in climate change denial, and most of whom during the pandemic were involved in anti-vaccine and anti-mask mandate efforts. And today, many of these same groups are attacking critical race theory. Now, some people may ask, how do we distinguish between propaganda and disinformation and not just legitimate political or academic opinion? Well, there are many ways we can do that, but I think for me, the most compelling one is simply to point out that the key argument of market fundamentalism is false. That is to say, we know it's false from the facts of history. The indivisibility thesis is easily refuted by history for the simple reason that capitalism and freedom are not indivisible, and the free market has not protected, much less guaranteed, our other freedoms. So without recapitulating the entire history of capitalism, suffice it to say that we know that the early history of unregulated capitalism and unregulated markets produced a world of hurt and suffering. It was a world that was cruel and dangerous, that included widespread child labor, children as young as 6 routinely working in mines, mills, and factories, and sometimes even as young as 2. What William Blake famously called the dark satanic mills, brutal working conditions, starvation wages, no limits to the hours that workers could be forced to work, and dense pollution that impacted not just the workers themselves, but the health of the surrounding communities. It also included violent suppression of unions, Native American industrial assimilation schools designed to destroy Native American language and culture, and of course, slavery. In the early 20th century, industrial capitalism was so dangerous that many people referred to what they called the accident crisis, the large numbers of workers who were killed or severely injured on the job every year. In the year 1900, 1 in every 1,000 workers was killed on the job every year in America. That would be the equivalent of 1.5 million people dying every year. So more than all the people who died in the COVID pandemic in the United States being killed in industrial accidents. In fact, in 1914, it would have been safer for a young man to fight in World War I than to go work on the railroads or in an anthracite mine. And of course, American capitalism had not brought freedom to the 10 million Black Americans who were enslaved in the U.S. South, nor had it protected the legal or political rights of female citizens or Native American citizens. And unregulated markets were bad for democracy. Monopolies and trust had led to vast accumulations of wealth by robber barons who corrupted both markets and political systems. And of course, the Great Depression had proved that the so-called free market not only did not guarantee political freedom, it didn't even guarantee prosperity. Reckless financial speculation and unscrupulated and unregulated business practices had played a major role in the crash of 1929. But a good deal of this suffering, this corruption, and this denial of freedom was remedied not by the free market, but by law and regulation. And it did not lead us into Soviet-style centralized planning and totalitarianism. In fact, it strengthened democracy and civil society. It protected the freedom of workers, of children, and of Black Americans. All these facts were known to von Hayek when he wrote The Road to Serfdom in 1944, and they were all known to Milton Friedman when he wrote Capitalism and Freedom in 1962. But they brushed these facts aside. The truth, of course, as we all know, if we even stop to think about it for just a few minutes, is that freedom is not protected by our forms of distributing goods and services, but by our forms of governance, by our laws and our civic norms, and, perhaps most importantly today, by academics who insist on telling the truth about American history. So I'll stop there and leave time for questions and discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Naomi. I want to invite our viewers to enter questions in the Q&A, which is you can see at the bottom of your screen. And we have one question now that I think I'll go ahead and read. The question is, with reference to merchants of doubt, what role do you think science literacy, especially at the undergraduate level, could play in helping young adults understand scientific uncertainty?
Well, I think scientific literacy is important. I think science communication is important. And I certainly don't want to criticize or denigrate anyone who is working on programs to improve scientific literacy or to improve scientific communication. But I think what our work shows is that they're not really the main events in the story. I mean, people do get confused somewhat because they don't understand, some aspects of the science involved. But honestly, climate science is not that complicated. Carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. That means it traps heat. You put something in the atmosphere that traps heat, the planet warms up. I mean, it's basically that simple with a few complications around the edges. Most of climate change denial doesn't, if people are ignorant about science or if people have low levels of scientific literacy, obviously it doesn't help, but it's not how most science denial works. Most science denial works by appealing to political claims, by appealing to fear, by creating anxiety. And so that's where the whole argument of freedom kicks in. The claim is, oh, you're going to lose your freedom. Those Democrats are trying to take away your right to drive a big car. Those liberal academics want to take away your right to eat hamburgers. And so they shift the conversation. It's a kind of politics of distraction. It's a form of misdirection. And so I think it's more important, not so much to teach people more science, but to teach people about how propaganda, how disinformation, and especially how misdirection works. I'm involved in a project right now with a magician because one of the fun things we're doing together, magic is all about misdirection. And so we're thinking about maybe trying to write a book talking about how the concept of misdirection is really central to propaganda and disinformation.
Yeah, this question about expertise and how on the one hand it can be denied and can be opposed and at the same time embraced on another level by government. I just want to point out that Sarasota County, the county commissioners recently voted to make the county a medical freedom sanctuary, meaning
yes,
that you are entitled to refuse treatment. You are entitled to any treatment that you deem worthy or correct. Do you have any response to that kind of government proclamation and encouragement to reject science and expertise?
Well, I think that's exactly aligned with what I was just talking about, right? The whole notion of medical freedom, that we should have the right to decide for ourselves. And it's tied to an ideology of radical individualism that denies the reality that we live in a society together, that the choices I make affect the people around me. And so it has to be addressed, again, I think not so much with more science about how vaccines work, although, that could be helpful in some cases, but to point out that it's a misguided notion of freedom. So we really need to have a better conversation about political philosophy, political economy. What do we even mean by freedom? And what did the founding fathers mean by freedom? Because it's really a misrepresentation. I mean, we see how in Adam Smith does not believe that freedom means that I have the right to do something that would burn down your house. And yet that's in effect what these people are doing. They're burning down the house. There's a biography of Newt Gingrich with that title, Burning Down the House. They're burning down the house by saying, well, if you spread a deadly disease, oh, well, that's your right. That's your freedom. But that's not how it's been viewed through most of American history. And if you think about it, in a longer version of this talk, I have examples of statutes that were passed in the United States that conservatives, Republicans, the Supreme Court thought were all fine, but yet you probably couldn't pass today. And one of them is, and people probably don't know this, but the first statute ever passed to require mandatory vaccination was in Massachusetts in 1803. 1803, more than 200 years ago. If you tried to pass that law on the floor today, it would certainly fail. If you brought a law like that to the Supreme Court, it's not clear what the current Supreme Court would do. But there is a huge history in this country of saying, yes, we do have a right. We, the people, as represented through our government, do have the right to restrict freedom when it threatens the safety and the security of those around us. And so it's a really grotesque misrepresentation of what freedom has even historically meant, even in this country, much less in other countries. And so I think that's the argument that we have to point out. These people are not really protecting freedom. They're actually putting the freedom of all of us who might, in fact, get sick and die. They're putting our freedom at risk.
Right. Here's another question from the Q&A. I worry about the answer to this attack being, quote, trust the science, unquote. Science, after all, is not politics, and we don't want scientists legislating, just as we wouldn't want the inverse. How do you react to the politicians saying trust the science, and do you agree with the sentiment of this catchphrase?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so, no, I don't really agree with the sentiment of that catchphrase. I think saying trust the science is not actually a helpful way of putting it. If you wanted to say trust scientists about science, that would be better. And that is essentially the argument of my book, shameless plug, Why Trust Science, right? So the argument of this book is, well, actually, we shouldn't have a blind faith in science. And we absolutely should not trust individual scientists, because individual scientists we know can have all the same biases and prejudices of the rest of us. But science as a process, science as an enterprise, science as a way of learning about the natural world, a form of critical scrutiny in which scientists themselves are self-critical and ask tough questions and subject their work to peer review by other independent people, that process has proved very powerful and very effective. And it has given us safe and effective vaccines. And it has helped to give us useful technologies like the computer that I'm talking to you on right now. And it has enabled us to do fun things like, travel on airplanes, right? So science as an enterprise has made our lives healthier, longer. I don't know about happier. That's a more complicated question. So the point is that science is a way of learning about the world that's very, very effective. And we should stand up and defend it as a way of learning about the world that can help us solve a lot of problems. But it's not the only way. We all know that there are Native American traditions that maybe carry more wisdom than traditional Western science. We know there are other medical traditions like Ayurvedic medicine that seem to work well for certain kinds of problems. Acupuncture has been shown to be highly effective, even though Western medicine can't explain it. So any kind of slogan that seems to imply a blanket trust or sort of technocratic trust in experts, I think is problematic. But if we can find a slightly more nuanced way to say, we should trust scientists to give us scientific evidence on questions for which science is relevant and important. And in my book, one of the arguments I make is that if we think about scientists as a form of worker, if your pipes were leaking, you would call a plumber, but you would not call a dentist. But if your teeth hurt, you would not go to the plumber, you'd call the dentist, because these are the people who do this work in our society. And we live in a society with very extensive division of labor. Scientists are our people. I mean, in the early 1920s, there was an organization called the Association of Scientific Workers. It was a left-wing organization that emphasized the idea of scientists as workers And if we think about scientists as our workers, our people who do the work of figuring out certain kinds of problems, and for that, we should trust them and be happy and be grateful, just as I'm grateful to have a good dentist or a good electrician.
Naomi, what would you suggest scientists should do in response to the forces you have uncovered in your work?
Well, it's very tricky for scientists because the instinct of all scientists that I shouldn't say all, but virtually all scientists that I've ever known or worked with is to do more science, right? And to think that this is a problem of scientific illiteracy. And, I once was at a meeting where a prominent climate scientist said, if we could just get the error bars down, then people would understand this and they'd act on climate. And that's a complete misunderstanding of the problem, right? The reason we failed to act on climate is not because the climate science is too uncertain. It's not because the error bars are too big. It's because powerful political and economic forces have been aligned to undermine public trust in climate science, to make us think that the science was unsettled and uncertain and that we didn't know that this was a real thing, and to make us fear that any approach to fixing the problem will strip us of our liberties. That's what we're up against. And so that makes it quite difficult for natural scientists who, by and large, are not trained in political economy, don't necessarily have good public communication skills. I mean, they're really out of their lane when they start to try to address these other issues, which is, I think, in part why Eric Conway and I wrote Merchants of Doubt in the first place. We wrote that book in part because I started getting attacked. And we quickly learned that there were scientists who had been attacked, but none of them had known how to respond because it was so out of their realm of conceptualization. And their instinct, as I said, was just to do more science. So I think the most effective thing that natural scientists can do is to collaborate with social scientists and humanists to make common cause and to find ways to work together, both to explain the science, because the American people and people all around the world have a right to know. They have a right to ask hard questions about the science. I mean, how do we know the vaccines are safe? How do we know climate change isn't caused by volcanoes? These are all legitimate questions, and natural scientists can play a helpful and important role in giving clear and non-condescending explanations and answers to those questions. But they have to also work with social scientists and humanists who can explain the larger social context, and humanists who can explain that this notion of freedom that is being put forward by people in your state is a false notion of freedom.
So it makes me wonder about the changes that have taken place in graduate education in science. To hear you speak now, you would think that there would be required to have seminars in the political dimension of science. Do you find that this has been picking up, that this is becoming more a part of science education at the graduate level, or are we still catching up?
Well, I guess I'd say both. So when I was in graduate school studying natural science, there was precisely zero discussion of any of these issues. And if you were interested in any of these things, you were told that you didn't have time to do those kinds of things. And that's probably partly how I became a historian of science, because I wanted to do these things. And the only way to do them was actually to leave, science sensu stricto and professionalize as a historian of science, because in history of science, you were permitted to have these conversations. So there was none then. There's a little bit now. I certainly get invited to talk to a lot of science departments, and so that's nice. I think a lot of scientists have come to understand that they are living in this highly politicized landscape that can't be understood simply by learning more thermodynamics. But I wouldn't say that it's been mainstream. I certainly can't think offhand of any university program I know that requires, scientists to do a minor field in political science or history. I think they should. In history of science, many historians of science will do a minor field in the relevant science. It'd be awfully great if scientists would do a minor field in the relevant social science or humanities. That's not something I see happening a lot, but it's certainly possible going forward. I do think that increasingly natural scientists are, at least some of them are starting to recognize that, you could do the most perfect science in the world. You could get the answer to the fourth decimal place. You could parameterize your models, in an unassailable fashion. But if the politics and the power structure is aligned against you, it won't matter how great your science is. And I think that climate scientists have now known that for more than a decade. I think virologists and immunologists learned it in the last few years. And I've had lots of calls from natural, biological scientists this year, who never read Merchants of Doubt until this year. And, so they're starting to recognize this as a problem too. So I think there's a kind of opening here. And I would hope that to the extent possible, social scientists, humanists, artists would look for ways to collaborate with natural scientists, because I do think that real headway could be made if we could think better about how to communicate, and particularly getting back to that trust in science question. It's not a call for blind trust in science. It's not a call for technocracy. And to simply say trust the science is not sufficient. But how can we communicate a sense of the power and frankly the beauty of scientific understanding with an appropriate respect for democracy and an appropriate attack on disinformation?
Well, I think you're talking about the culture of science. And you can have a culture that's rather insular, or you can have a culture that is making the kind of connections or allowing for those connections to be made. I'd also hazard to say that from the opposition to liberal arts, from more authoritarian types, is precisely that it encourages students to ask questions that link disciplines, that work across disciplinary lines. So I think you're onto it there. This is another question that's been submitted. How do you see government suppression of scientific data, as happened in Florida with COVID, as linked with the broader trends you identify between business and science? Do you view the growing distrust in science, as articulated by government officials, as rooted in promoting freedom or other profit-related agendas?
Well, this is very tricky, and this is where, of course...
Sorry.
No, that's okay. It's a very good question, and this is where, of course, as a historian, I have to acknowledge that, history is all about change over time. And one of the hard things about writing a book that attempts to partly explain our current situation is it's a moving target. So in the work we did in The Big Myth, we show how this is really a story of business elites, of plutocrats, of powerful trade organizations aligning to work to promote a particular vision of how the economy works and how the economy should work, and to promote a very limited sense of what the role of government should be in protecting workers, citizens, the environment, children, etc. And in the early part of the story, science doesn't really play much of a role. It begins to play a role more in the 1970s and the 1980s as scientific evidence for environmental problems like acid rain, the ozone, or climate change comes to the fore. Also scientific evidence for the harms of tobacco use, DDT, other harmful products. And so there's where we begin to see the Republican Party and certain of their political allies, obviously the fossil fuel industry, obviously the tobacco industry, but also to a certain extent the electricity industry. We see these industries beginning to align with an anti-scientific agenda. And so a lot of my work that I didn't talk about today, but my work with my colleague Jeffrey Supran on the history of ExxonMobil is all about how ExxonMobil then begins to align with this anti-scientific agenda. And we know, again, from other people's work, President George H.W. Bush accepted the scientific evidence of climate change, but we also know that there was a lot of pushback in his administration, particularly from his chief of staff, John Sununu, who had close links to ExxonMobil. It was Esso at the time, but it soon became ExxonMobil. Pressure from the right wing of the Republican Party aligned with ExxonMobil to push the president to back off the commitment that he had made in 1992 in Rio. And so industry begins to become aligned with this anti-scientific position with respect to the environment. Now, the last 3 years has been a very interesting complication, and that's the COVID pandemic, because suddenly the political alliances shift. Because here we have big pharma on the side of science, on the side of vaccines. And so one of the interesting things that happened during the pandemic, interesting from the point of view of a historian sitting in a safe study, living in the country, tragic for the over 1 million Americans who died during the pandemic, was that big pharma was on the side of science. And one way I think about this whole situation, imagine if big pharma had not been on the side of science. Imagine if big pharma had actually been on the anti-vaccine side for whatever reason. We wouldn't have just lost over 1 million Americans. We would probably have lost 3 million Americans. It was the fact that we could develop a vaccine rapidly, get it out with the support of the federal government, with the support of most states, but not all states, that enabled millions of Americans to be safely vaccinated. And there's an important book just written by Peter Hotez of Baylor University, who was on the sort of, cutting edge of this whole vaccine issue during the COVID pandemic. He's done calculations that show about 500,000 Americans died after the vaccines were widely available. And those people are grossly disproportionately self-identified or registered Republicans. And that's an unbelievable tragedy for their families, for themselves, for their friends, for their communities. But it also raises the interesting point. Will there be a moment in which these people wake up and see how the ideology of their party has not served them? It hasn't happened yet, but I think that there are some small hopeful signs that it could happen, because refusing to be vaccinated on political grounds, it's not just foolish, it's deadly. And we now have the evidence that proves that.
Well, it's interesting that you just cite, the production of the new vaccines that occurred in record time, a real example of how scientists can be mobilized to address an issue very quickly. But it leads to this question from another one of our watchers who says, so how do we effectively defeat the tsunami of free market lies in time to stop the burning of the planet?
Well, that's my whole life, baby. If you figure it out, then come graduate work with me at Harvard. Yeah. And give copies of The Big Myth to everyone you know.
Yeah. Okay, well, we are just about out of time. I think we'll wait and see if there's any more questions in the chat. I just wanted to read one. This person submitted it as an observation rather than a question. At Bard College, for what it's worth, we offered a required common course that addresses the politicization of science for all students, including science students, in their first year.
Wow.
So again, kind of how do you create a culture?
Right. That's very, I don't know of any other school that does that. I know of a few schools that have used my books as common readings, but that's awesome. I'd love to see that syllabus if you'd be willing to send it to me.
That would be interesting. Maybe Jocelyn Becker can help us with that. So, all right. Well, at this point, with no other questions, I want to thank Naomi for your contribution to this today. It was a pleasure to listen to you, scary as well. But we thank you so much for your time. And again, we encourage all the viewers to consult with the Alt Liberal Arts website for additional events that will be coming down very soon. Again, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you. It's been a pleasure.